I put out a video that was about 3 minutes long, basically talking about the two most important aspects within life, and that was mostly, sorry, spoilers, going over freedom and health, those being the two most important aspects. Well, that is the most two important aspects, but what about the two most important things to use on behalf of those aspects? So freedom and health are very, very important, and they're interrelated. Well, what is also the thing that helps manifest those? And that would be reduced down to two things: reason and education. Okay, so individual reason and then education for the masses. You can say individual health and then freedom for the masses. You can make connections between these four things in total. But reason is this ability that humans have to learn, to understand concepts, to understand that there's a cause to everything, to understand that there is more than faith that they can understand scientifically, and that education, which reason leads people into, is ultimately what then changes minds, which then changes actions, which then changes the world because of the actions. So reason and education are both essentially one and the same, just as freedom and health, because if you have a disease, you are not so much free. That disease is taking you over. So freedom and health are one and the same. Reason and education are one and the same, but reason and education for freedom and health. Now, why would you use education for freedom or health, you may ask? And I have many videos talking about this in case you're interested and you're new to this whole perspective. But the Founding Fathers often stressed about how necessary education was for freedom, and within natural law, we talk about something called the law of freedom, which states that as morality increases, freedom increases. But how do you understand morality? That requires education, because it requires knowledge as to what is right and what is wrong, which you may say, well, is that subjective or objective? I would tell you it doesn't matter. You need to understand just the knowledge of what is basically harming someone, what isn't, what's causing a victim, what's involuntary action, what is involuntary. Ask yourself, well, what is a wrong action based on your knowledge? And then ask yourself, well, would I want this done to someone else if I don't want it done to myself? Look at the basic principles of karma and how that works, where things come around in reality if you do certain things long enough, aggregated enough people especially. You have to ask yourself, well, then is that order, is that chaos? So there's definitely education there, because otherwise it's just chaos, because there is no order to be found. Order is found in saying, well, things must be this way, these things must be stacked in a certain way, right? That is order. And so without knowledge to say, well, this goes here, this goes here, this goes here, that's not order, that's chaos. Everything's everywhere and nobody really knows what's happening, and that's actually what we have today, despite our many so-called systems which claim to be of order, which claim to be of security, which claimed hundreds of years ago that would never grow into the systems that it is today. So what drove us wrong? What made us go wrong? And one of the biggest things you may say is, well, education. Maybe people aren't educated enough on the Constitution. They're not educated enough about what the Founding Fathers were saying. Well, are we dependent on the Founding Fathers? I think we should be more dependent upon our natural understanding of our world, because what they were pointing to were greater, higher laws of nature, natural law. They were talking about morality and equal rights. And rather than looking at their words or the ideologies of them, I think we should just look at what they're exactly trying to point to, which is, how do we define a right? How do we understand what is property, what is ownership? Because ultimately then that led to the end of chattel slavery, which our Founding Fathers did not really address that much. But of course some of them did, and ultimately the ideas of freedom brought it to that point where there was no need of politics for that to happen. That was a moral cause to end slavery. It was purely done out of education. So that's a perfect example of education and reason for freedom. I mean, you had a reason with a slave master to say, well, what he was doing was immoral. I mean, how would you reason with this guy, right? He thinks that his slave is helping him so much, he doesn't want to do the work himself, perhaps. He sees it as perhaps even legal, so he sees it as right, because he equates legality with morality. And he sees how everybody else is doing it. He sees that it's a trade around the world. It makes the economy work. It makes his businesses work better. I mean, how are you going to reason with this guy to free his slaves? And most of these slave masters were unreasonable, but some of them were. It was dependent upon reason. And if they were reasonable, then they would be willing to educate themselves and say, well, maybe it is wrong because of the government of God, or because I have such a thing as morals, and understand that these are other human beings who can also have their own property, their own ownership. Otherwise, they're slaves, and if I'm not a slave, what makes them to be a slave, right? We're all just human beings. Just because they have a darker skin color, well, what makes them different just because of that? And we've done that to them. We were the culprits to that. So that requires education. And so that's education on part of the slave master, but if they're unreasonable, then you have to question, well, what's the reason to end slavery there? Well, then the slave has to free themselves, or the people who are educated have to help the slave free themselves. And ultimately, every slave has to free themselves in order for them to be truly free. But freeing the slaves from the slave masters, in the case of chattel slavery, or any slavery really, is dependent upon that slave also being educated enough to say, well, yeah, the slave master does not belong to be in charge of me. I can actually be in charge of myself. And what if I were free, right? What if I were free? And what if, other people can help us in our freedom, because we were abandoned and brought here over by ships and who knows what, right? So there's great reason for the slave to want to be free. And as we move forward in today's world, we realize there's great reason for us to be free, because our world is becoming increasingly more tyrannical, which is no coincidence, essentially correlated to slavery, tyranny and slavery, democide and slavery. Okay, these things should be equated with one another, just as I equated these other terms. Because democide, slavery, tyranny is all the opposite of freedom, essentially. Okay, it's saying that there's people in control of your life, control of your property, and control of your own ownership. Saying that they own you. They're claiming ownership, even though that can never be done in nature. I mean, you're just born, and then they're like, okay, well, you're owned by somebody. It's like, okay, how does that work? Their reason is not very much reasonable. So that's why reason is so important, because most actions that are done out of not enough reason are ones that contribute to harm or are likely to be seen as controversial. So with reasonable intent and with education amongst that, that also helps provide for reason, and henceforth you provide more freedom to what you can do and more health, more structure in what you're saying. So let's say you have to prepare a speech, right? You have to educate yourself on what you're actually talking about. And maybe it's a speech about something that you have to do in the future, right? So you want to have the freedom to do this thing, but you want to make sure everybody's okay with it, and you want to make it clear what you're actually doing. So you provide the health, the structure to your argument, and freely speak about that too, so that way it's also more humanly understood. And therefore, using freedom and health and the freedom of the spoken word to deliver your reason, which is for the education of the words that you're delivering to everybody else, which hopefully are also educated enough to understand your words. So everything relies on these four aspects, because if they don't, then we're just not human beings, or at least we're not better human beings, because human beings need to talk to one another, they need to have morality, they need to be free, they need to be healthy. All these things are so important that if you took any one of these things out, it's like, are you really human after all, or are you just a beast in a cage and that doesn't really know anything? Because when the slaves are taught how to read and they know what they are slaves, knowing that what slavery is, then they're not slaves anymore. But if they don't know what those things are and they don't educate themselves enough, or they don't have enough education in general, they're not going to be free. And this is why education is so important, but everybody stresses that education must come in the form of school systems, which never teaches them about slavery or rights or the basic fundamentals to freedom. And even if you go to philosophy classes, they just teach you everybody's ideologies. They don't want you to make an introspective look into the universe for yourself, perhaps. Now, some people, don't get me wrong, they're going to do that. I don't want to make a big generalized statement, but This is why I coined the term limited philosophy, because so many people want to copy what the founding fathers did or what other people did without making their own understanding of the universe based on the same ability that those people also used, which was their reason. Okay, so reason and education, you can't just have one or the other. They're both one and the same. Just as much as a parent should teach their kid, not the school system, because that is real education. They're the most reasonable to be with the kid because it's their kid, and not only that, but they can reason more likely with each other since they're of the same blood. So they also have more freedom because there's more trust, and there's better health because they share the same genetics and they can share the same responses. You understand how this works now? And you can apply this across the board. So this is why it's the two most important things to use. I think that I covered pretty much everything, and of course you can use other examples too, but in order to create freedom and health, we need to use reason and education. That's the sum of this video, and I hope that this maybe helped some people look into the fact that, well, if somebody asks, what do I do? You say these two things, and if they sound surprised because it's not practical enough, you ask them, well, why do you think education's not important? Is knowledge not what changes the world? And ask them, like, what is their method of changing the world instead? And if they say politics, well, then resort them to my video talking about how political action is useless. And really challenge them on that. And then just that alone will educate themselves about what action they should do. Because believe it or not, you can't escape education just as much as you can't escape reason, so long as you are using your human nature, which is speaking to other human beings. So nature for nature, which I always say, use your nature or you'll lose it. That's my common phrase I often say in interviews and such, but it's true. And so as long as you're using it, you will find these things. But most people in the day-to-day life want to ignore things and not reason, not educate themselves, not care about health, and therefore not care about freedom. None of these things are reasonable to them because they don't reason to begin with. They don't educate to begin with. If they are an educator, then things change. So we need to promote people being teachers, which relies in finding some spark in people. What are they interested in? What do they like to talk about? What do they like to teach others? And if they have kids, this should be something they understand even more, because they have to teach their kids how to grow up in life. Well, think about it with other people too. I mean, you got to teach people how to do things that they don't know how to do. And if it includes understanding, well, how do we create tyranny versus how do we reduce it, it's the same thing. Okay, just most people don't apply it to politics, but you have to apply morality to politics because politics itself is so useless without it. Politics doesn't really matter. Okay, with morality it doesn't matter because politics is usually the negation of morality, and that's why it is such a problem in this world. So morality breaks every barrier, and I'm going to stress it again and again, but that is what ultimately you're educating about, because if you care about someone's health, you're going to want to heal them. That's health. If you care about somebody's property, you're going to help them be free. That's freedom. Morality is in all these things. Thank you very much. Corey at Ninjalot, Nature's the Answer.